When we think about the Third Reich, we usually picture generals, armies, and grand strategies. But one of its most crucial figures wasn't a soldier at all. He was a different kind of architect. See, he didn't build with steel or stone. He built with words, with images, and with fear. Joseph Goebbels was the chief engineer of Nazi Germany's entire communication system, a master of psychological warfare who basically designed the blueprint for a nation's descent into total darkness.
It's a pretty chilling question, isn't it? But it's one we absolutely have to ask. How on earth does an entire society get transformed, its values completely flipped upside down, to the point where it can justify the absolute unthinkable? Well, it begins when reality gets replaced by a narrative, a powerful one, and right at the heart of the Nazi narrative was its most fanatical storyteller, Joseph Goebbels. To really get how he did it, we have to start with the man himself. To understand the propagandist, you really have to understand the person first. Where he came from, what he wanted, and the deep, deep insecurities that would end up fueling his terrifying rise to power. So, this right here tells you everything. You see this profound contradiction. On one hand, you've got this highly intelligent man, a PhD from a really prestigious university. But on the other hand, a life of just crushing failures. His dream of becoming a great writer, it was met with rejection after rejection, forcing him into jobs like a bank clerk, which he absolutely hated. And then, on top of all that, was his physical disability, a clubfoot that gave him a limp, and with it, a huge sense of inadequacy, especially in a culture that was obsessed with physical perfection. And this desire, this need to be compensated, it became the engine of his entire life. Historians have pointed out that his pathological ambition, this relentless drive for power and recognition, was all just a way to make up for what he lacked. He needed influence, like a suit of armor, to protect him from his own weaknesses. So the big question is, how does a frustrated intellectual become one of history's most terrifying fanatics? Well, it happened in a single defining moment, a moment of total psychological surrender. What's really interesting is that before he became a die-hard Hitler loyalist, Goebbels' politics were, they were surprisingly flexible. He was actually drawn to the more socialist, anti-capitalist wing of the Nazi Party. He wasn't born some rigid ideologue. He was just a man looking for a cause to belong to. And this was the moment it all changed. Hitler called this conference specifically to crush that socialist faction Goebbels admired. For 2 hours, Hitler just tore their ideas apart, calling socialism a Jewish creation and promising to protect big business. Goebbels literally watched his entire ideological world just crumble right in front of him. And his own diary says it all. You can feel the shock, the horror. He felt completely adrift, like his convictions were just shattered by the very man he was starting to look up to. For a moment, he was totally lost. But then, the pivot was immediate. Within moments, that devastation turned into pure devotion. He went to Hitler, completely capitulated, and traded every single one of his old beliefs for this fanatical, almost religious loyalty to one man. And Hitler, he saw the value in this desperate, articulate intellectual and gave him power almost immediately. Okay, so now he's armed with Hitler's trust and a real position of power. And this is where Goebbels begins to build the most sophisticated and frankly terrifying propaganda machine in modern history. The key to this whole operation had a deceptively simple name, Gleichschaltung. It just means coordination. Sounds pretty bureaucratic, maybe even harmless, right? In reality, it was the systematic takeover of an entire nation's soul. And he achieved this total control in 4 methodical steps. First, he created a state-run chamber of culture. Pretty simple. Second, he made membership in that chamber mandatory for anyone working in media or the arts. Third, he kicked out anyone they deemed undesirable, Jews, political opponents, modern artists, which basically stripped them of their ability to make a living. And finally, he made it law that journalists had to act as state propagandists. Just like that, there was no more free press, only the state's voice. And this policy of cultural purification had its most infamous moment just a few months after he took power. At this massive book burning in Berlin, Goebbels stood up there triumphant and declared an end to Jewish intellectualism. A century earlier, the poet Heinrich Heine had warned, "Where one burns books, one will, in the end, burn people." For Nazi Germany, that transition took only 8 years. So this is the crucial point. This propaganda machine wasn't just about controlling thought. It was built for a very specific purpose: to prepare the German people, step by step, for mass murder.
And this escalation, it wasn't random at all. It was methodical. It started with cultural cleansing, then moved to legal segregation with the Nuremberg laws, then escalated to state-sponsored violence during Kristallnacht, and finally it culminated in the forced visible marking of every single Jewish person. Each step just normalized the next one, stripping away rights, and then eventually humanity itself.
Goebbels sold Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, as some kind of spontaneous outburst of public anger. But these numbers, they tell the real, chilling story. This was a coordinated nationwide attack. Over 1,000 synagogues burned, more than 7,000 businesses destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps, all in a single night. This wasn't popular rage, this was organized terror.
And even before the Holocaust really began, there was a horrifying rehearsal. It was called the T4 program, and it targeted disabled Germans, labeling them life unworthy of life. This is where the Nazis pioneered the use of gas chambers. It's where they perfected the methods of industrial-scale killing. And the very same staff who ran these centers, they would later go on to operate the death camps in Poland.
Now, as the tide of the war started turning against Germany, Goebbels' role had to shift. He couldn't sell easy victories anymore. His new job was to sell sacrifice, defiance, and ultimately, a nation's own self-destruction. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, he delivered his most famous speech. And it was a masterful performance. Instead of hiding the bad news, he used it to whip this hand-picked audience into a frenzy, demanding a war more total and more radical than ever before. It was pure political theater, designed to galvanize a population that was staring defeat right in the face.
And he finally got what he wanted. After the failed plot to assassinate Hitler in 1944, a paranoid Führer gave Goebbels almost dictatorial power to mobilize every last resource, men, women, and materials, for a war that was already completely lost. But total war, of course, led to total collapse. And in those final, desperate days in a Berlin bunker, the propaganda story reached its terrible, logical conclusion. The day after Hitler's suicide, Joseph and Magda Goebbels committed their final act of devotion. They just couldn't imagine a world without National Socialism, so they decided their children wouldn't live in one either. They poisoned Helga, who was 12, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 6, and Heidrun, who was only 4. Then they took their own lives. You see, the story of Joseph Goebbels is so much more than a history lesson. It's a timeless warning. It shows us that one of the greatest dangers to any society isn't just a flawed ideology, but the willingness of ambitious, insecure people to serve that ideology for their own personal power. And that forces us to ask a really difficult question. Where does that same vulnerability lie in our world today?